The twin moons of Xypherian cast a cold, silver glow over the grand throne room, illuminating the crystalline walls with an eerie brilliance. Silence reigned, broken only by the measured steps of Queen Seraphina as she descended from her obsidian throne. Her piercing violet eyes swept across the chamber with the authority of a goddess, her presence an unshakable force that commanded reverence and fear. The air itself seemed to tremble beneath her power. Before her, kneeling in chains, was a man unlike any other human she had seen. Orin. A mere slave, yet he did not bow as the others did. His back was straight, his silver-white hair falling messily over his forehead, framing sharp, defiant gray eyes that locked onto hers without fear. His chiseled form bore the scars of labor, but there was something else, something unsettlingly strong beneath his skin, something unbroken. Seraphina's lips curled into a smirk. Foolish. Humans were weak. Inferior. Nothing more than tools to be used, bodies to be discarded. And yet, she could not ignore the fire burning in this one's gaze. He was different. The court watched in silence as she took slow, deliberate steps forward. The chains around Orin's wrists clinked softly with each movement, the sound a stark contrast to the hush in the room. Seraphina stopped mere inches away, tilting her head as she studied him. "I see no fear in your eyes," she mused, her voice smooth as silk but laced with steel. "Tell me, human. Do you not understand your place?" Orin's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. He did not need to. His silence was an act of defiance in itself. A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles. An insult of this magnitude could not be tolerated. Any other slave would have been executed on the spot. Yet Seraphina merely smiled, intrigued rather than angered. She turned to her High Minister, Xyler, a gaunt Xypherian with eyes like polished obsidian. "This one amuses me," she declared. "I shall keep him." Xyler's expression remained unreadable, but the slightest flicker of something passed through his gaze. Hesitation? Concern? Seraphina dismissed it. Whatever it was, it did not matter. She was queen. Her will was absolute. Two guards stepped forward, yanking Orin to his feet. Despite the rough treatment, he did not wince, did not struggle. His composure remained ironclad, his expression unreadable. He walked forward under their grip, but it was clear this was a man who refused to be dragged. As they passed, Seraphina's eyes caught something, a faint glow on his wrist, just beneath the metal shackles. A symbol, intricate and ancient, pulsing with an energy that made her skin tingle. Seraphina frowned. That was no ordinary mark. She glanced at Xyler, whose gaze had darkened. He recognized it too. But instead of speaking, he gave a slow, deliberate bow and remained silent. Whatever he knew, he would not reveal it, not yet. Intriguing, indeed. Seraphina turned back to Orin, a slow smirk returning to her lips. Perhaps this human was more than he seemed. The cold air of the royal dungeons bit into Orin's skin, but he barely noticed. Chains bound his wrists, suspending him from the ceiling, his feet barely grazing the stone floor. Blood trickled from fresh wounds on his torso, but he made no sound. He had endured worse. Queen Seraphina stood before him, arms crossed, her violet eyes burning with cold amusement. She had been testing him, pushing, prodding, waiting for the moment he would break. Yet he never did. "You are resilient for a human," she murmured, stepping closer. "Most would have begged by now." Orin lifted his head, meeting her gaze. "Then perhaps you are testing the wrong species." A flicker of irritation crossed her face. "Insolent." The guards flanking her shifted uneasily. No slave had ever spoken to her in such a way. The punishment should have been death. And yet, she hesitated. Seraphina reached out, gripping his jaw tightly, forcing him to look at her. "You are nothing," she hissed. "A tool to be used. A piece of flesh that can be broken." Orin's lips curled into a faint smirk, despite the pain. "Then why haven't you broken me?" Her grip tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she released him abruptly, turning on her heel. This was infuriating. A slave should not be so composed, so unshakable. It was unnatural. And yet, something about it intrigued her. Days passed, and the queen continued her tests. Forced labor. Deprivation. Isolation. Orin endured it all in silence. He did not lash out, did not plead. He simply endured. But then, something happened. Seraphina had been walking through the palace corridors when a commotion erupted nearby. A Xypherian noble had been cornered by a rogue beast, one of the genetically enhanced war creatures bred for battle. Somehow, it had broken free of its restraints, its fangs bared, eyes glowing with bloodlust. The noble cowered, powerless against the monster. Before Seraphina could react, a blur of movement shot past her. Orin. Despite his wounds, despite his chains, he moved with terrifying speed. In an instant, he was between the beast and the noble, his body acting as a shield. The creature lunged, claws slicing through the air, but Orin did not falter. He twisted, grabbing hold of its throat, using its own momentum to slam it against the wall with a sickening crack. The beast whimpered and went still. Silence fell. Orin turned, his breath heavy, eyes meeting Seraphina's. He had just saved one of her own. A human, protecting a Xypherian. She should have been furious. Should have reprimanded him for acting without permission. Instead, she felt something else. Something dangerously close to admiration. The court was abuzz with whispers that evening. "Your Majesty," Xyler spoke cautiously, his dark eyes studying her. "You are allowing this human too much leeway. It sets a dangerous precedent." Seraphina sipped her wine, her expression unreadable. "He acted without my command," she said flatly. "He will be punished." Xyler hesitated. "And yet, you have not executed him." She set her goblet down. "Should I have? He saved one of our own." The ministers exchanged uneasy glances. It was not like their queen to defend a human. Seraphina leaned back in her throne, fingers tapping against the armrest. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. Perhaps Orin was not as insignificant as she had believed. The air in the grand banquet hall shimmered with the glow of suspended crystalline chandeliers, casting iridescent reflections over the assembled nobles. Laughter and music wove through the air like a delicate thread, masking the undercurrents of tension that had begun to seep into the foundations of Seraphina's rule. She sat on her throne at the head of the long banquet table, her violet eyes scanning the room. Something felt off. The nobles smiled too easily. Their laughter was too forced. Even Xyler, her most trusted minister, was subdued in a way that made her skin prickle. Then she saw it. A glance. A subtle nod between two of the high-ranking officials. The barest flicker of movement near the entrance. The realization struck her like a dagger to the ribs. Betrayal. Before she could react, the doors to the banquet hall burst open with a deafening clang. Heavily armed soldiers, dressed in the sigils of her own royal guard, stormed inside, weapons drawn. Gasps filled the room as the nobles shot to their feet, feigning shock. Seraphina remained seated. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let them see her falter. Xyler stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Then he knelt. "My queen," he said, his voice a perfect mask of servitude. "You have ruled with strength, but strength breeds enemies." The meaning in his words was clear. He had orchestrated this. Seraphina's fingers curled around the goblet in her grasp. "You dare betray your queen," she murmured, her voice dangerously soft. Xyler did not flinch. "It is not betrayal, your majesty. It is correction." At his signal, the soldiers raised their weapons. The first shot was fired. Chaos erupted. Seraphina moved with the reflexes of a seasoned warrior, flipping the banquet table over just as a plasma bolt seared through the air where she had been seated. The force of the explosion sent shards of crystal and metal flying, cutting through the panicked crowd. Screams echoed as nobles scrambled for cover, some too slow to escape the carnage. Pain seared through her leg as something sharp pierced her flesh. She hissed, stumbling back. Her blood streaked down her thigh. She had been hit. Xyler's soldiers advanced, their weapons trained on her. She tried to rise, but her leg buckled beneath her. The world tilted. No. She would not fall like this. A hand grabbed her arm. Orin. The slave. He was there, crouched beside her, his silver-white hair illuminated by the burning chandeliers above. His storm-gray eyes locked onto hers. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice steady. She bared her teeth. "I do not need your help, human." "Funny," he said, throwing her arm over his shoulder despite her protest. "Because you're bleeding all over me?" A group of soldiers spotted them, raising their weapons. Orin moved before they could fire. With strength unnatural for a mere human, he propelled them both forward, weaving through the debris as plasma bolts exploded around them. He guided her through a side corridor, where the palace walls were beginning to collapse from the impact of the battle. Seraphina gasped as pain lanced up her leg. She tried to pull away. "I can fight." Orin shot her a look. "You can barely walk." She wanted to argue. She wanted to shove him away. But she knew he was right. They had no choice but to escape together. The palace burned as the queen and her former slave disappeared into the night, their fates now irrevocably intertwined. The cold night air bit at Seraphina's skin as she and Orin stumbled through the dense, alien forest beyond the palace walls. The distant glow of the burning capital flickered behind them, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost in mere moments. She clenched her teeth against the pain in her leg. Each step sent fresh agony lancing through her body, but she refused to falter. A queen did not show weakness. Yet, it was the human her slave who kept her upright. "We have to keep moving," Orin said, his voice calm but urgent. "They'll be searching for us." Seraphina glared at him. "I know that." A sudden roar echoed through the trees, freezing them both in place. The foliage rustled violently as an unseen creature stirred in the darkness. This planet was not just home to her people, it was home to monsters. Orin pushed her gently behind him, his stance tense. "Stay close." She bristled at the command, but for once, she held her tongue. Hours passed as they navigated the treacherous forest. Strange bioluminescent flora illuminated their path, casting eerie shadows. The cries of distant predators sent chills down Seraphina's spine, but Orin moved through the terrain with a natural ease that baffled her. He was supposed to be a mere human. Weak. Inferior. So why did he carry himself like a warrior? Finally, they found temporary refuge beneath the roots of an enormous, gnarled tree. Seraphina collapsed against the bark, exhaustion threatening to claim her. The wound on her leg had stopped bleeding, but the pain throbbed relentlessly. Orin knelt beside her, pulling a small vial from his belt. "This will help." She eyed the vial warily. "Where did you get that?" He smirked. "Let's just say being a slave teaches you to be resourceful." Before she could protest, he tore a piece of his own shirt and began dressing her wound with surprising gentleness. Seraphina hissed at the contact, but she did not pull away. For the first time, she truly looked at him not as a slave, but as a man. The firelight from the distant city reflected in his silver hair. His hands, calloused yet careful, worked with practiced precision. His gray eyes met hers, filled with something she couldn't quite place. "I never expected you to help me," she admitted, her voice quieter than before. Orin's lips quirked into a small smile. "I never expected you to need my help." Silence stretched between them, charged and unspoken. For the first time in her life, Seraphina wasn't sure who held the power between them. And that terrified her. The night was far from silent. The howls of alien creatures echoed through the dense jungle, their cries a haunting reminder that danger lurked beyond the shadows. Orin moved swiftly, his every step precise, as if he had walked these treacherous paths 1,000 times before. Seraphina, despite her regal poise, struggled to keep pace, her injured leg slowing her down. "We need to rest," she finally admitted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Orin stopped, scanning their surroundings. "Not here," he murmured. "Too exposed." She frowned. "Since when does a slave give orders to a queen?" He turned to her, his silver hair catching the faint glow of the bioluminescent flora. "Since the queen is too wounded to fight." She had no retort. He wasn't wrong. They found shelter beneath the twisted roots of a massive tree, its gnarled bark forming a natural alcove. Orin crouched beside her, inspecting her wound. The makeshift bandage was soaked in crimson, a stark contrast against her pale skin. Seraphina flinched as he reached for her. "I can manage." Orin arched an eyebrow. "Can you?" She held his gaze, unwilling to admit her vulnerability. But then, a sharp cry cut through the night, followed by the rustling of leaves. Something was coming. Orin reacted first, moving with unnatural speed. He grabbed her arm, pulling her behind him as 3 shadowy figures emerged from the foliage. They were not Xypherian soldiers, but mercenaries hired hunters sent to track them down. A bolt of plasma shot toward them. Orin shoved Seraphina aside, dodging the attack with inhuman agility. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and unleashed a power she had never seen before. A pulse of energy radiated from his body, a shimmering force that sent the attackers flying backward. The jungle trembled from the sheer impact, leaves swirling in the wake of his unleashed strength. Seraphina's breath caught in her throat. That was not normal. That was not human. The mercenaries scrambled to their feet, their faces contorted in shock. One of them, a reptilian warrior, hissed in disbelief. "Impossible. He's one of them." Orin didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning, striking with precision, disarming and incapacitating them within moments. When the last mercenary fell unconscious, silence settled over the jungle once more. Seraphina pushed herself up, her mind racing. What was that? Orin exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I was hoping you wouldn't see that." She narrowed her eyes. "See what?" "That you're not just a slave." A tense silence followed. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not just any human, Seraphina." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I am the last of a race that should have never existed." Her pulse quickened. "Explain." He hesitated before pulling back his sleeve, revealing a glowing sigil etched into his skin. It pulsed with an eerie blue light, ancient and powerful. Seraphina recognized it instantly. A symbol of an extinct lineage, one that had been wiped from Xypherian history. "You," she whispered, realization dawning. "You are a descendant of the Eldari?" Orin nodded. "The Xypherian Empire destroyed my people centuries ago. I was taken as a slave before I even understood what I was." Seraphina's mind reeled. The Eldari were a myth, a forgotten race erased from existence. Yet here he was, standing before her, proof that history had been rewritten. Orin met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Now you understand why they fear me?" Seraphina did not answer. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure who the true enemy was, the traitors who had taken her throne, or the lies she had been raised to believe. The jungle slowly gave way to a barren expanse of land, its cracked surface whispering of ancient secrets buried beneath. Seraphina and Orin moved cautiously, their weary bodies weighed down by exhaustion and the unspoken tension between them. The revelation of Orin's lineage had changed everything. The very foundation of Seraphina's beliefs trembled under the weight of the truth. "This place, it feels different," Seraphina murmured, her violet eyes scanning the desolate landscape. Orin nodded. "It should. We're standing on the remnants of my ancestors' last stronghold. The Xypherian Empire ensured that no one would remember it. But memories are not so easily erased." He knelt, pressing his hand against the cracked ground. The sigil on his wrist glowed faintly, and almost as if responding to his touch, the earth trembled. A soft rumble echoed beneath him before the ground parted, revealing a hidden pathway leading into the depths of the forgotten ruins. Seraphina hesitated. A part of her screamed that this was treason. That she was walking into a place where her people had spilled blood. Yet another part of her, the part that had begun to question everything, urged her forward. They descended into the darkness, the air thick with dust and memories of a past long buried. The corridor widened into an underground chamber, its walls etched with symbols, Eldari's symbols. Orin ran his fingers across the carvings, his expression unreadable. "This is proof," he whispered. "Proof that my people existed. That they were more than the savages your empire painted them to be." Seraphina's fingers clenched. "I never doubted that they existed. But history tells." "History tells lies," Orin interrupted, turning to face her. "Your ancestors feared us, Seraphina. Not because we were a threat to peace, but because we were a threat to their rule. We possessed abilities they couldn't control, so they did what all tyrants do, they erased us." Before Seraphina could respond, movement echoed from the shadows. Figures emerged, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They wore tattered armor, their expressions wary yet filled with something Seraphina had not seen, directed at Orin before reverence. One of them, a tall woman with streaks of silver in her dark hair, stepped forward. "You bear the mark," she said, her voice laced with disbelief and hope. "The blood of the Eldari still flows through you?" Orin squared his shoulders. "I am Orin, the last of my kind." "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "We are the Forgotten. The last warriors of a lost people. And you, Orin, are the heir, our only hope." Seraphina inhaled sharply. "Heir." The woman's gaze flickered toward her. "The Eldari were not just exterminated. Some of us survived in hiding, waiting for the day when the rightful descendant would return. You stand beside the one who could change the fate of Xyphera." Orin's jaw tightened. "You expect me to lead a war?" "We expect you to reclaim what was stolen," the woman corrected. "Your people were slaughtered, your legacy erased. But you still exist. That means fate has not abandoned us yet." Seraphina's mind reeled. This was not what she had prepared for. She had spent her life believing in the supremacy of her empire, in the righteousness of her ancestors. But standing in the ruins of a civilization her people had destroyed, hearing the pleas of those who had been wronged, she felt the weight of guilt pressing against her chest. "And what of me?" she finally asked. "I am Xypherian, the daughter of those who committed these atrocities." The woman studied her. "The past cannot be changed, but the future is unwritten. The question is, Seraphina, will you continue to serve a lie? Or will you seek the truth?" Silence stretched between them. Orin watched her, his expression unreadable. Seraphina felt the ground beneath her shift, not physically, but metaphorically. Everything she had believed in was crumbling, and she did not know if she had the strength to stand amidst the ruins. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Orin exhaled, stepping closer. "Then find out. Because if we're going to survive this, we need to know where we stand." Seraphina met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that she had never noticed before. Expectation. And perhaps, just perhaps, hope. The air was thick with tension as Orin and Seraphina stood before the gathered rebels. The flickering glow of the torches illuminated hardened faces, warriors who had spent their lives fighting in the shadows. They looked at Orin with reverence, calling him the heir, the one who would restore balance to Xyphera. But there was no time for ceremony. Tonight, they would strike. Orin unfurled a crude map of the enemy base, spreading it across a stone slab. "This is where they are keeping the war supplies," he said, pointing to a central structure. "If we take it out, we cripple their ability to reinforce their armies." Seraphina, arms crossed, studied the map. "What about the security measures? They won't just let us waltz in." A rebel commander, a scarred Xypherian named Kale, nodded grimly. "Their defenses are tight. But they won't expect an attack from the old tunnels beneath the outpost. That's our way in." Seraphina glanced at Orin. "Then we move before they realize what's coming." The raid began under the cover of darkness. Orin led the charge through the underground tunnels, their footsteps muffled by the damp soil. The air smelled of rust and decay, a remnant of a bygone era when the tunnels served as trade routes. Now, they were paths to war. As they neared the base, Seraphina's heart pounded in anticipation. Despite her wounds, she refused to be a burden. She was a queen, and she would fight as one. Orin gestured for silence. They reached a grated exit leading directly into the heart of the enemy compound. With a quiet motion, he pried it open, and they emerged into the shadows of the base. The first guard never saw them coming. Kale slit his throat before he could raise the alarm. They moved swiftly, disabling patrols and setting explosives at key points. Then, everything went wrong. An explosion rocked the base, but it wasn't theirs. The rebels turned in shock as alarms blared to life. Lights flooded the compound, and soldiers poured out of barracks, weapons at the ready. "We've been set up," Kale cursed, drawing his blade. Orin clenched his fists. "How? We planned this perfectly." A slow clap echoed from above. Seraphina's breath caught as she looked up and saw him. High on the platform, draped in the robes of authority, stood Lord Varen, her most trusted advisor. "Ah, my dear queen," Varen said, his voice rich with amusement. "I was beginning to wonder when you would show yourself." Betrayal burned in Seraphina's veins. "You," she spat. "You orchestrated this." Varen smirked. "Of course I did. You were always too blind to see the rot within your own court." The Empire deserves better than a weak queen who sympathizes with slaves. Seraphina's grip on her blade tightened. And what do you think you deserve, Varen? The throne. He chuckled. Not just the throne, Seraphina. I deserve a legacy. And you? You're just an obstacle. With a wave of his hand, soldiers surrounded them. Kill them all. Chaos erupted. The rebels fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered. Plasma bolts lit up the battlefield as Orin tore through enemy lines, his hidden power unleashed. He moved like a storm, striking with deadly precision. Seraphina fought beside him, pain searing through her injured leg. But she did not falter. She was royalty, and she would not bow. Despite their strength, the tide turned against them. Varen's forces were overwhelming. Kale fell, cut down by enemy fire. One by one, the rebels were pushed back. Orin grabbed Seraphina's wrist. We have to go. She resisted, her pride warring with reason. But she knew he was right. This battle was lost. With a final glance at the burning compound, she allowed Orin to pull her into the shadows. They would fight another day. But vengeance would come. And when it did, it would be merciless. The city of Xyphera stood on the brink of war. From the hills overlooking the Grand Palace, Orin and Seraphina stood side by side, gazing at the fortress where Lord Varen had taken the throne. Fires burned in the city below as the rebellion surged through the streets. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Tonight, we take back what was stolen, Orin declared, his silver hair illuminated by the crimson glow of the burning skyline. The warriors around him, human and Xypherian alike, let out a battle cry. Seraphina tightened her grip on her blade. We end this. Varen falls tonight. The battle erupted with a force that shook the foundations of Xyphera. The rebels stormed the palace gates, clashing with the elite guards of the Empire. Laser fire lit up the night as explosions tore through the outer defenses. Orin fought at the front, cutting down enemy soldiers with a ferocity that could not be matched. His movements were too fast, too precise. His hidden power had fully awakened. Seraphina led another squad through the eastern wing, slicing through Varen's personal guards with ruthless efficiency. The halls she once walked as a queen were now a battlefield soaked in blood. Deep inside the throne room, the real battle awaited. Orin crashed through the grand doors, his breath ragged, his blade dripping with the blood of his enemies. At the center of the chamber stood his final opponent, a towering Xypherian warrior clad in obsidian armor. His piercing golden eyes locked onto Orin with an unsettling familiarity. You have no idea who you truly are, do you? The warrior sneered. Orin tightened his grip. I know enough. And I know that you stand between me and justice. The warrior smirked, drawing a massive energy blade. Then come, heir of the forgotten. Prove your worth. The battle began with a violent clash of steel and energy. The Xypherian warrior was a behemoth, his strikes powerful enough to crack the marble floor beneath them. But Orin was faster. He ducked and weaved, striking with precision, forcing his enemy onto the defensive. Yet, something gnawed at the back of his mind. How did this warrior know about his past? Elsewhere, Seraphina faced her own nemesis. Lord Varen stood at the top of the throne room steps, a cruel smirk on his lips. You should have stayed in exile, my queen. Seraphina raised her sword. And let a traitor rule my empire? Never. Varen lunged, their blades meeting in a deadly dance. He was fast, too fast for a politician. Each strike he delivered was calculated, precise. Seraphina gritted her teeth as realization struck. You were trained for this, she hissed, blocking a strike aimed at her heart. Varen laughed. Of course, dear Seraphina. Did you really think I spent all those years at your side for loyalty? I was always meant to take your place. Anger burned in her veins. She would not let him win. The duel raged on, each move bringing them closer to the throne, the very symbol of everything Seraphina had lost. But she was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Xyphera. With a final surge of strength, she feinted left before pivoting sharply, driving her blade through Varen's chest. He staggered, blood spilling from his lips. You were never worthy. Seraphina twisted the blade. And you were never meant to rule. With that, Varen collapsed, lifeless, on the cold marble floor. On the other side of the room, Orin's battle was reaching its climax. The Xypherian warrior had Orin pinned against a shattered pillar, his energy blade humming dangerously close to his throat. You fight well, boy. But you are still incomplete. Your true power. Orin roared, summoning every ounce of strength within him. A shockwave of raw energy erupted from his body, sending the warrior flying across the room. As the dust settled, Orin stood tall, his eyes glowing with an ethereal light. The warrior coughed, kneeling before him. You are the last of your kind, he murmured. The true heir of the forgotten bloodline. And now, you are ready. With one swift motion, Orin ended the battle. The war was over. The throne was reclaimed. As dawn broke over the war-torn city, Orin and Seraphina stood together at the palace balcony, gazing upon the ruins of the old regime. The people below cheered, their cries of victory echoing through the air. Seraphina turned to Orin. What now? He looked at her, his expression unreadable. We rebuild. Together. And so, a new era began. The dawn of a new era had arrived. The war was over, but the scars of battle remained. Smoke still lingered in the air, and the remnants of destruction marked the once pristine halls of the palace. The people of Xyphera, both human and Xypherian, gathered in the city square, awaiting the fate of their empire. Seraphina stood before them, her once immaculate royal attire now tattered and stained with battle. She had reclaimed her throne, but she was no longer the ruler she once was. The weight of the crown had changed, no longer a symbol of absolute power, but of responsibility. She raised her voice, addressing the crowd. The empire as we knew it has fallen. The corruption, the oppression, it ends today. From this moment forward, Xyphera will not be a kingdom built on division and servitude, but on unity and strength. The chains of slavery are broken. No being shall be lesser than another. A wave of murmurs and gasps spread through the crowd. For centuries, the Xypherian elite had ruled with an iron grip, believing themselves superior to all others. This decree was unprecedented, a declaration that would reshape the empire forever. Seraphina turned to Orin, standing at her side. He had the chance to leave, to finally be free of the empire that had enslaved him. But he remained. You should go, she said softly. You have no reason to stay. Orin met her gaze, his silver hair reflecting the golden light of the morning Sunday. I have every reason to stay. My place is here not as a ruler, not as a warrior, but as someone who believes in what you're trying to build. And as someone who... He hesitated, his usual confidence wavering. But Seraphina understood. In the chaos of war and betrayal, they had found something unexpected in each other. She stepped closer, reaching for his hand. Then stay. Not for duty, not for war, but for us. Orin intertwined his fingers with hers. For us. The crowd erupted into cheers, not just for their queen, but for the promise of a future unshackled by the past. But even as hope bloomed, the shadows of the old world still lingered. There were those who would resist change, those who would seek vengeance for the fall of the old empire. The war was over, but the battle for peace had just begun. Seraphina looked out at her people, then back at Orin. "This is only the beginning." He nodded. "Then let's face it together." And so, under the rising sun of a reborn Xyphera, the future remained uncertain, but for the first time, it was theirs to shape.